Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maeve, and on behalf of Carosoft Corporation, I would like to welcome you to our Domino Data Lab webinar, Ages on a Mission, Building Guardrails for Agentic AI in Government. Before I'd like to get started, we're going to go over a few quick logistics.
Thanks, Maeve. Hey, I'm Michael. Thank you for joining us today. I'm a solutions engineer here at Domino Data Lab, and I'm going to be your host today. This session is called Agents on Mission, Building Guardrails for Agentic AI in Government. And over the next hour or so, we are going to talk about what it takes to move Agentic AI out of the prototype phase and into production. So what we covered today, 6 segments, the bulk of which is going to be a fireside chat with my colleague Mina. And then we're going to get into a little bit about how do we actually operationalize the things that we talk about. So why this conversation? Why now? Agentic AI is already sort of transitioning from the sandbox and into real government workflows. And what makes an agent different from like the kinds of AI that we typically use is that it doesn't just predict or classify, right? So it actually reasons, it plans, and it takes multi-step actions on its own. So the question is no longer, can we build these systems because we've seen them? The question is whether we can actually trust them, govern them, and then actually deploy them responsibly. So that's what today is all about. Um, so let me talk a little bit about just our backgrounds. Mina, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about yours first?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. I'm Mina. I am a research analyst at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, which is a think tank based in DC that studies the security implications of emerging technologies like AI. At CSET, I focus on AI governance, which is really kind of the collection of policy and technical levers that we have at our disposal to really harness the benefits and mitigate the risks of AI systems. I've worked on AI evaluation methodologies, kind of AI standards ecosystems, AI governance frameworks, sort of a whole host of different topics that fall under the AI governance umbrella. And at CSET, I also serve as the analytic lead for Agora, which is CSET's AI governance tracker. It's really a living collection of AI-related governance documents. So you can think of standards, regulations, and laws from around the world. I'm really pleased to be here today. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Mina. And as for me, I have spent the majority of my career in the intelligence community as a data scientist and a DevOps engineer, primarily working on some of their counterterrorism targeting programs. I've also spent some time at the George C. Marshall Center in Germany, where I worked on strategy development within their countering transnational organized crime program. So here is sort of the plan for today. Mina and I are going to have a conversation about the principles first, so where the frameworks stand and what good governance really means. And then we'll shift gears and show you what it takes to build those principles. So why don't we jump right in? So you spent a lot of time sort of tracking how AI governance documents are piling up faster than anyone can actually use them. Um, sorry. So why don't we pause really quick and just answer this poll that is on your screen right now. I'll give you about 30 seconds to answer this. Cool. So yeah, so you spent a lot of time talking about how AI governance documents are piling up faster than anyone can actually use them. So let me start there. Are the frameworks that we have today genuinely built for autonomous multi-step systems, or are we just hoping that they stretch far enough?
Yeah, so I mentioned in the intro that I've done some work mapping and organizing AI governance frameworks. And what I can tell you is that they take many, many different forms. So some AI governance frameworks are focused on the different stages of an AI system's lifecycle. Others are focused on kind of implementing responsible AI principles in practice. And then others are kind of focused on different components of an AI system, like its algorithms or the data that it's trained on. Lifecycle-based frameworks can be used to inform the design and the development of agentic AI, but they might fall short upon deployment. So generative AI systems or large language models are usually kind of prompted by humans to provide outputs or answers once they're deployed. Whereas agentic AI really can operate autonomously with limited human supervision once it's deployed. And so those sort of natural checkpoints that are built into, say, like chatbots or large language models aren't necessarily present for AI agents. Principles-based frameworks, so frameworks that kind of are centered around characteristics like AI explainability and AI robustness. Those can be a little bit difficult to operationalize because AI practitioners have to decide, what does AI explainability actually look like for an agent operating in this context or this other context? And it also requires organizations to think really deeply about who's responsible for different aspects of the agent's behavior. And finally, I mentioned kind of components-based frameworks, and these are frameworks that can help guide like the data governance of AI agents. But they may not be well equipped to address kind of complex networks that consist of many different agents interacting with each other, or sort of the assortment of tools that agents have at their disposal to interact with the outside world. Um, I know, like here we're sort of talking about the presence of governance frameworks and documents, but I think it's also really important to talk about the adoption of these frameworks. They're only going to be impactful if organizations adopt them and if there is sort of an appetite to manage the risk of AI systems and govern them effectively. And so it's really important to communicate the benefits of AI governance within an organization, kind of greater worker satisfaction, a more efficient business, so that people actually trust these systems and adopt them. And the last thing I'll say on this is that AI governance frameworks or AI governance documents can take the form of sort of voluntary or process-based frameworks, like the ones that I mentioned before. But you could also view AI-related laws and regulations as AI governance documents, essentially kind of instruments that carry the force of law. And in the US, it's sort of a complicated landscape right now. There are AI laws emerging kind of at the state level. There's a patchwork of different approaches. Some laws aim to govern systems that are deployed within certain domains and within certain sectors. And then other laws are really geared towards kind of addressing different classes of AI systems. So frontier AI systems, for example. And so, AI agents that are deployed in certain domains, or maybe across multiple domains, agents that are sort of rely on compute-intensive, powerful large language models, it's possible that these systems, would be covered by some of the laws that are emerging.
I think that's a great place to start because if the frameworks weren't even written for agents, right, then even a phrase that we all tend to use, something like human oversight, can get kind of vague quickly. So let's try and actually define it, right? So everyone says that they support meaningful human oversight until you ask them to actually define it. So what does it actually need to look like for agentic systems?
Yeah, so really kind of human oversight and human supervision should be calibrated to the level of risk of the agentic AI use case. So you can kind of imagine, in high risk scenarios where an agent is making decisions that have potentially severe consequences. These decisions are irreversible. It's a life or death situation. Then you probably want agents to escalate a lot of their decisions to humans before taking any action. And sometimes agents will have to do this kind of selectively, especially if speed is really critical to safety. And so I'm thinking of kind of conflict scenarios where a warfighter has to act instantly in order to kind of prevent serious harm from happening. In high risk scenarios where speed is less important, you could have a human actually review most, if not all, of sort of the agent's determinations before it actually acts on them. In lower risk scenarios where there's a high volume of decisions being made, the decisions are recoverable. They're not really, if something goes wrong, it's not really going to severely impact people's lives. Then in these scenarios, you could have an agent operating mostly autonomously within certain bounds while still preserving the ability for humans to intervene or to just kind of oversee the agent's behavior.
And so oversight only really means something if you can like actually see what the agent did, right? So why don't we go on to traceability here? So every uh, risk framework sort of talks about the reproducibility and the traceability like they're a given, right? But building them is a completely different story. So what does that realistically sort of require?
When I think of reproducibility and traceability for agents specifically, I think of um, logging systems, I think of alerting and incident reporting systems, and I also think of kind of the importance of humans within the organization and building strong accountability structures. And so, logging systems are systems that can really kind of record an agent's actions, behaviors, any anomalies that arise. And this log can be used by people to kind of diagnose undesirable behaviors that are appearing. Things that a logging system might capture include kind of, an agent's access control. So what kinds of systems and databases does the agent have access to? What kinds of tools is the agent calling? Are there certain data access events happening? Is the agent interacting with other agents within an environment? And this kind of metadata is super critical for one kind of ensuring that the agent is operating as we expect it to, but two, like I said, also kind of helping to diagnose really strange or out of bounds behavior. Um, Alerting, that's kind of where alerting and incident reporting systems come into play. So these systems can actually, flag when things are going wrong, when alarm bells are going off. And incident reporting systems can actually be used too to help diagnose the root cause of the problem of the strange behavior. And data from these systems can also be used to update agent policies, organizational policies, and ensure compliance with regulations that are on the books. Um, um, and then finally, kind of building like lines of accountability into these systems is really key. And so, that might involve kind of decomposing an agent into both the resources it relies on, but also the functions, the domain-specific functions that it performs. So these could be things, like what policies does the agent adhere to? What tools is the agent using? What kinds of domain-specific tasks is this agent performing? Is it conducting, no kidding, like scientific research? Is it helping out with kind of customer service workflows? Is it doing something else? And so by kind of decomposing the system into these parts, you can actually map, okay, the organizations and the people who are actually responsible for, overseeing and managing those different components.
So I think you touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious what you think about once an issue is traced or found, then who's actually responsible for like fixing that, right? Like implementing a change to ensure that it doesn't happen again in the future.
This is a tough question because sometimes it is clear that an agent is misbehaving because of kind of its core technical functionalities. Like something has gone wrong there. Maybe it hasn't been trained correctly. And in that case, the AI developer would probably be responsible for fixing those issues. In other situations, it may be obvious that the user, directed the agent or sort of gave the agent access to certain systems that it shouldn't have access to. And so this can kind of show up as like permission creep. And so in those cases, I think the user would be responsible for the agent accessing kind of sensitive or personal data. But sometimes it's not so clear who is responsible. So if a user kind of asks the agent to carry out a task, but the goal is really is somewhat ambiguous, it's not well defined, and then the agent kind of goes off and does something unexpected, then it's not entirely clear whether that's due to the user maybe not specifying exactly what they wanted the agent to do, or if it's due to the agent's kind of fundamental safety guardrails failing. And so it's really kind of important to, especially if you're an organization that's procuring agents or other AI systems, to really kind of specify in those contracts like who is responsible for what when certain failures happen.
Cool. So we know what good looks like on paper now. So the obvious next question is why so many promising deployments never actually get to production? Um, and so a lot of promising agentic deployments are stuck in prototype right now, right? So from a governance perspective, what's actually keeping them there?
Yeah, so the environment in which an agent is deployed can look very different than the environment in which the agent was piloted in. And so this can sort of, manifest as the agent being able to access certain applications or tools that it wasn't exposed to in kind of the pilot environment. And this can lead to sort of unexpected or undesirable behaviors, especially if those tool access configurations, or if tool access hasn't been configured correctly. Similarly, the agent might be exposed to, new data sets or sensitive data upon deployment. Conversely, an agent might not have access to kind of the underlying data that it really needs to perform effectively. Um, it's also possible that that the people who are actually using the agent in production or overseeing the agent's actions were not involved in the design of the pilot. And so this means that the agent's workflow might not really account for how people are engaging and kind of how they normally work. And that might lead to kind of low adoption of the agent or sort of just an overall distrust of these systems.
And I think there's one more thing that sort of keeps projects stuck, right? And that's the evaluation that sort of stops the moment you launch. So, like even if these agents are performing really well when you first launch them, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year down the line, they stop performing as well. Um, so most streams sort of treat evaluation like a pre-flight checklist, right? So like they do it once at the very beginning, but it's not a continuous process. Um, agentic systems sort of keep evolving, right? Like once they're out in the wild. So what does continuous evaluation actually look like, or what should it look like?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that makes AI evaluation so challenging is, also makes kind of transitioning agents from pilot to production really difficult. And that's just that, you know, business priorities shift, real world conditions change. And so the environment in which the agent is operating in is going to naturally shift over time. And that can, pose challenges both for kind of scaling up an agent kind of organization across the organization, but also make it difficult to kind of keep a hold on assessing the capabilities of these agents at kind of consistent points. Um, so really kind of for evaluating these systems, even kind of well before deployment in the development process, organizations can the goal for organizations is really to make sure that agents adhere to kind of enterprise policies, that they, are designed in such a way that they don't go off the rails, that they're going to operate as intended. And these kinds of evaluations that can help gauge that are kind of largely AI benchmarks. And so these are tests that, evaluate a system. On a particular task using kind of a set of metrics or a combination of metrics. And these benchmarks can test a number of different things from an agent's ability to kind of code or kind of develop different software programs to an agent's kind of propensity for really kind of dangerous or misaligned behavior, its ability to persuade users, and among other kind of capabilities. And so it's really important to kind of perform this suite of tests and think about what kinds of evaluations need to happen well before the system reaches a production environment. Right before deploying the agent. So, during pre-deployment evaluations, organizations can test whether agents, kind of operate as expected in an environment that closely mirrors its deployment environment, as well as kind of under conditions that are complex and adversarial. So it's good to test whether, an agent is sort of robust to attacks by malicious actors or even kind of, um, you know, kind of benign user behavior that just, might lead to like unintended consequences. Um, it's also important kind of before deployment to test out a bunch of different agent variants. So to figure out which agents work best for you and see how they perform across kind of latency and cost dimensions. Um, and finally, conducting kind of just an impact assessment. And this is where other other folks from the organization, not just kind of data scientists and machine learning engineers, but really, folks on kind of the operations teams, on kind of the external affairs teams, on kind of the business side come into play and really kind of evaluate, okay, what's kind of the financial, legal, operational kind of risk exposure from these systems. So people have a very clear picture of what the risk profile is before the agent is released into the world. And then finally, once an agent is deployed, we're talking about continuous evaluation. So having, evaluations that are kind of, periodically or continuously running, checking to see what the agent's, accuracy, reliability levels look like, making sure that the agent isn't acting in dangerous ways, isn't hallucinating. All of that is really important. Um, and also just having systems that are kind of constantly monitoring agents and tracking whether an agent, suddenly kind of has access to certain tools or systems that maybe it shouldn't be able to use. And also kind of tracking agent performance over time to see whether it's keeping up with some of the kind of goals that are set for it, or if maybe performance is declining over time, which may signal something about business priorities. It may signal something about kind of what's happening in the larger world too.
So I think that's a great setup for the second half because everything that you just sort of spoke about, right? Like the oversight, the accountability, the traceability, and the continuous evaluation, those are all sort of like the governance needs, right? And my job with Domino is to help turn each of those into something that our users can actually build. So why don't we start walking through what that may look like? Before that, we do have a new poll. I'll give you guys another 30 seconds or so to answer this. Cool. So everything that Mina just walked through are sort of the governance needs, right? So what my team and I do at Domino is we turn each of these into a concrete capability that you can actually build yourself. So why don't we go through them and sort of map them one to one, right? So we'll take the first, which is human oversight. So in practice, that's sort of like an approval workflow. That would be like a defined point where a human has to sign off or can step in and actually stop the agent from continuing. So oversight stops just being something that's like, uh, you know, uh, talked about and becomes like a required aspect of the workflow. The second that we have here is accountability. So that sort of references the full audit trail. So every action that the agent takes is logged, and that includes the who, the why, the when, the how, so that nothing happens like in the dark, right? So that you can always trace things back and you can understand why it took certain actions and so on. The third that we have is so lineage, right? So here is where you can sort of follow any like a decision that the agent took through each of its steps and then every input that actually produced it, right? So that you can recreate what already happened to understand why those actions were taken. Fourth is uh, the reproducibility, so versioning and replay. So you can pin the exact version of an agent and then rerun it to reproduce those results, right? So let's say that there was one bad action taken, you can go back to that exact version and see why that happened. Next, we have the CE or the continuous evaluation. So this would be the monitoring and the testing that keep running after the launch, right? So not just before it. And this is sort of how do we tell if the agent was performing well last week, but it is making like um, uh, bad decisions now, right? So that sort of shift is something that we can only actually see if we have continuous evaluation here. And then lastly, we have the policy enforcement, which is the guardrails and the controls. So the one thing that I think we shall take away from here is that Domino isn't a single switch. So we implement guardrails and controls in layers. So at the outer edge, we have the AI gateway, which sort of controls which models people can even call, and it logs every request, right? So you can see which user was calling which model and how many tokens they used and so on. Then we can stand up the guardrail service. So this would be your own checks. So this can be simple checks for things like stripping PII, catching prompt injection, keeping the agent on topic, and so on. Um, and this can be either complicated or simple. So this can be as simple as a pattern matching regex that looks for, 9-digit strings that match like what a social security number would look like. But it can also be very complex as well. So the tracing and the scheduled evaluation sort of watch over whether those guardrails are actually holding in production. And then a governance policy can require an agent to be wired to those guardrails prior to it ever being deployed. So the policy stops being like something that you sort of take a look at the very end of your data science workflow, and it actually becomes integrated into every step that the data scientists take. So one example of the kind of guardrails that you guys can actually build is like, let's say that an agent is about to send a outbound email, right? And the guardrail checks the content that's in the email against your NDAs first. So it can pull like the relevant confidentiality agreements and then reason over whether anything in those messages actually crosses them. And then the agent can either clear it, they can redact it, they can deny it, or they can route it to a person as well. So in a commercial setting, that's probably going to be something like an NDA. And for those of you that work in classified settings, that can be something like the classification guides, just to ensure that nothing is being shared that shouldn't be. So it can, do things like search for FISA or for US person data. So it's the same pattern that's applied to the classification and the need to know. Now that's a guardrail that you can build on the Domino platform, but it's not something that Domino ships, and that's actually deliberate. So that is just because we want the customers to implement guardrails and governance that matches their exact use cases. So yeah, like I said, Domino doesn't ship a fixed set of guardrails. We implement guardrails and governance through a layered system. So the first system is the AI gateway. The second system is the guardrails service. So this is a service that you guys would stand up in your own project, and then every agent will call it. So this is where you can put the checks that you need, right? So it can be anything from PI redaction to the RAG pipeline for NDAs that I mentioned earlier. Then the tracing and evaluation. So this all happens within the Domino platform using just a simple decorator, right? And then this will populate the Domino platform with all of the tools that the agent calls, the prompts, as well as token counts. Then we can also implement the human in the loop step, right? So high stakes actions, like Mina said, can route to a human approver before the agent proceeds. Then the governance policy, right? So a policy can require that agent to be linked to specific guardrails before it's ever allowed to deploy, so that so this has to run through the entire life cycle, right? So we don't want data scientists just implementing this at the end. I have some experience with this, like while working in the IC, where I built some models didn't realize that they couldn't have US person data in them, and then at the very end had to restart from scratch, right? So that's what we are trying to avoid here. So we have the build phase. So this is where you experiment, you choose your tools, um, you design the agent, and this is where the governance portion starts, right? So every decision in every version is captured from the very first experiment. The second step is the evaluate step. So this is where you test any scenarios, you benchmark the performance, like you validate the risk. And this is sort of where you prove that the guardrails actually hold, but this is still prior to anything shipping to production. Then we have the deployment phase, and this is where you test your secure environments, you implement policy controls, and you implement the human review process. So this is where the oversight and the enforcement that I just described will actually stay. Then lastly, we have the monitor phase. So this is the continuous evaluation portion, runtime observability, and the governance reporting. So this is where the evaluation as an ongoing discipline really happens and where reporting sort of closes the accountability loop, right? So this is governance at every stage, and that is sort of the difference between a prototype and an agent that's actually running in production. So I think three main things that everyone should sort of take away from today, right? The first is that agentic AI is fundamentally different than governance, and it's a problem that requires its own frameworks, right? So the old sort of model era playbook doesn't really fit. And then the second is that organizations succeeding with agents treat governance as an operational capability rather than a policy document. And then lastly, the path from prototype to production depends on auditability, oversight, evaluation, and trust. So the bottom line is that the new frameworks need to build governance into the life cycle from day one rather than something that you scramble to add right before it goes into production. So one question that I wanted to ask you, Mina, like just at the end here, is that we've touched on sort of how to implement the guardrails, why they're necessary, what frameworks exist, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what does the upside actually look like, right? So when it's deployed responsibly, what actually becomes possible that wasn't before?
Yeah. So when AI agents kind of handle a lot of kind of the routine tasks, like debugging code or sending emails, that really frees up your time to do more interesting, fulfilling, and collaborative projects and things. So, one example would be working across teams to kind of brainstorm and build new products or features that could benefit the business. It frees up time for you to really think about some kind of key performance indicators and tailor them in a way that actually reflects the business's or your organization's priorities. Um, and so, there's a lot I think that you can derive kind of more on like a personal level. On a kind of more, organizational level, agents can, improve service delivery and certain business functions. So, agents, for instance, can escalate time-sensitive customer inquiries for human review, or they can track kind of supplies or resources to see when they're low and put in a purchase order for new resources. Um, and so this kind of can help a business, run more smoothly and more effectively. Um, Agents can also really lower the barrier to kind of novel like insights and especially insights from kind of dense, complex literature. And so, scientists, for instance, can use agents to synthesize enormous amounts of research literature and really kind of identify where there kind of are conflicting findings across reports, whether there's kind of a through line through the literature. And this helps them really identify where are the key gaps in our research. Where can we push the envelope of scientific discovery? Are we even asking the right research questions to begin with? And to kind of, keep on the topic of science and sort of the science and research domain, agents can also generate scientific hypotheses. They can design tests to evaluate those hypotheses and run those tests, and then analyze the results of those tests and repeat the cycle all over again. And so this, working with an agent, a scientist can really kind of test more, scientific hypotheses within a set amount of time relative to a human working alone without a machine. And so there are many, many different, possibilities out there where agents can really provide value. But one thing I do want to reinforce is that in most of the scenarios I just talked about, agents are not replacing human judgment. Instead, they're being deployed as helpers, as force multipliers within a human supervised workflow. And that's really where kind of our larger discussion of agentic AI governance comes into play. Agentic AI governance can help ensure that agents are, deployed in responsible ways in that they actually complement human work rather than kind of outright replacing the critical thinking of humans. So the resources on this slide really kind of help surface emerging, agentic AI frameworks that may be emerging, as well as existing more general purpose frameworks that could port onto the agentic context. So the first resource here is Agora, which I mentioned at the top. Agora is CSET's AI governance tracker, and you can find it at agora.eto.tech. And it's a really great resource just to sort of see, which AI governance documents are emerging and determine whether they touch on agentic AI at all. The second resource, a matrix for selecting responsible AI frameworks. This is a CSET report that actually surveyed many, many different AI governance frameworks and ultimately organized roughly 40 of them along the dimensions that we discussed earlier. So kind of along AI lifecycle stages, trustworthy AI characteristics, and an AI systems components. And so if you're interested in trying to make sense of this landscape of different frameworks, I recommend you check out that report. The third resource I have here is translating AI risk management into practice. This is a short form CSET piece that was originally written to help people operationalize one common AI governance framework, which is the NIST AI risk management framework. Some of you on the call may have heard of it. It's a framework that sort of organizes responsible AI guidance across several high-level functions, including govern, map, measure, and manage. But in sort of the context of AI agents, this resource could be used to help guide the development of kind of accountability structures within organizations, as well as build enforcement mechanisms for agents. And finally, the last resource here. Oh, well, actually, it looks like we've got another poll up. So please, take a few seconds to read through and answer that question. But while you're doing so, I'll just really quickly close out. Mapping the AI governance landscape is kind of the product of a collaboration between CSET, the organization I work for, and the MIT AI Risk Initiative. This was a project that really mapped documents taken from Agora to several MIT taxonomies that are focused on different concepts like AI risks, sectors, and other areas. And among other findings, we actually found that coverage of multi-agent risks was pretty limited relative to coverage of risks that pertain to privacy, security, transparency, across Agora's AI governance documents. And so I think that just kind of reiterates what we discussed earlier, which is that there aren't many frameworks that exist to actually govern agents specifically. And so it's useful to understand what resources there currently are, including kind of CSET resources, Domino's resources, to really get a handle on these emerging systems.
Thanks, Mina. So it looks like we have about 12 minutes left, so I think we can jump into Q&A now. So please send any questions that you have in the chat.
All right. Thank you, Michael and Mina. We do really appreciate you guys speaking with us today. And we are going to start the Q&A just as they just spoke on. So again, if you have any questions, just put them into the chat and we'll get those answered for you guys. All right. And one question that did just came in is, what does a team that's doing agentic AI with guardrails right now look like? And what are they doing differently than any other team?
Michael, go for it. I can follow if
Yeah, sure. So I think that the teams that I have seen that are I guess using agents like in a effective way is actually that one, they build in governance from the start, right? So they build the agents with governance in mind, and they actually build them step by step with the correct governance um, implementations in place. And the second is, I think, scope. So they understand what the agents should be doing, and they don't try to expand the scope beyond what what the agent can actually thrive at. Those were two things that I noticed, like the teams that I have seen who are correctly or effectively using agents tend to do is that they keep the smoke or the scope narrow, and they build in governance and checks from the beginning.
Yeah, I just want to, reinforce everything that Michael said. I think, organizations that do really everything that we covered, that think really thoughtfully about how humans are integrated into agentic workflows, how to implement reproducibility and traceability using logging systems and incident reporting systems, thinking carefully about how to evaluate agents not just before they're deployed, but also kind of in real time. Those are the organizations, the ones that are proactively thinking about all of these topics, or those are the ones that are going to really kind of succeed with agentic AI deployment.
Awesome. And then another question is, if you could ask every government team to do one thing before deploying their next agentic system, just one, what would it be?
Mina, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. I can take the first cut. So, it might sound a little counterintuitive to say, but in addition to defining what success looks like, I would say it's also important to clearly define what failure looks like and under what conditions an agent should be decommissioned, should be retired, should be taken offline. And the reason I say that is because those are good ways to um, those are good kind of drivers to remind organizations that they should be logging agent activity, that they should be kind of regularly meeting to discuss lessons learned from the agent's performance and how they might do things differently next time. Um, and ideally, these discussions and these findings can inform future agent deployments. We don't want to just deploy these systems for the sake of it. We don't want to just use technology for the sake of it. We want to be really clear about why we're deploying them, what goals they're achieving, and actually who is benefiting from the use of these systems.
Okay, and then another question is, can these sort of agentic systems be used effectively for multilingual customer interactions or documents? For example, if a customer asks questions in Spanish, French, Mandarin, German, or whatever, is the agentic AI at a point where it can effectively use its training corpus to answer in a multilingual way? Or would it be able to translate documents, publications as needed reliably and accurately for the user?
So these agentic systems, the performance of them are largely based on the performance of the large language model that's backing them, right? So I don't know like specific scores for all of these large language models, but I'm sure that some perform better on translation than others. But there's that big sort of semantic aspect to translation, right? So like you're not just translating word for word, like you are translating the meaning or the sort of undisclosed like the undisclosed sort of meaning. So that is something that could be possible or that will likely be possible in the future. But that would sort of require testing out different models, seeing which ones perform best on the languages that you are targeting, and then probably having a human do the actual checks, right? Like a human translator would probably need to come in and score the accuracy. They would need to double check certain things, especially if the documents are, like high risk or really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'll just jump in quickly here. I think it really depends on the deployment context. Um, you know, uh, I think large language models are quite capable now when it comes to translating documents between languages. For instance, in Agora, um, you know, we have Chinese AI policy documents within Agora's archive. And so, we have folks on our data team who have sort of tested out, whether a large language model could be used to just translate Chinese language documents into English, and apparently they're quite good. But we still have actually a kind of an expert translator on hand to check those translations and make sure that they're accurate. In lower risk and even lower risk scenarios, like for instance, if you're traveling abroad, maybe you're at a restaurant, there's a menu, it's in a language you don't recognize. You could probably, go to a large language model and ask it to translate. And if it gets it wrong, you might look a little bit silly, but the consequences aren't too severe. And like Michael said, in kind of higher risk scenarios where maybe you have someone working, say, in intelligence, and they've sort of encountered different, policy documents or different kind of recordings or correspondence in a foreign language, then it's probably really important to make sure that those translations are accurate, especially if they're directly influencing major policy decisions.
All right. And then lastly, most guardrail conversations focus on what to stop or constrain, sorry. Is there a case where strong governance actually opens the door to more ambiguous deployments, not fewer? Ambitious, sorry, not ambiguous.
Mina, do you want to jump in on this first?
Yeah, I can jump in first. So in my work, I often hear like AI governance and AI innovation framed as opposites. And I think it's really kind of oftentimes they're portrayed, it's portrayed as a false binary that either you have more innovation with less governance, or you have less innovation with more governance. And I think that is the wrong way of looking at it entirely. I think, just regulatory uncertainty in general is kind of a strategic risk for organizations. And so when organizations understand the laws on the books, they have strong policies in place to ensure that agents are being deployed in a responsible way, then I think that they're probably a little bit freer. They have more latitude in experimenting with different types of systems, different deployment environments, and different tools. And so I think kind of similarly, workers may trust agents more if their organization has very clear policies in place that say what allowable uses of the agent are, what disallowed uses are. And so workers may be more likely to actually take up these systems and work with them and see how they can benefit their day-to-day life.